Okay, so good morning. Today's daf is Yevamot daf Mem Daled. We'll be doing the most of we'll doing all of Mem Daled, finishing Mem Daled, and continuing through about half, a little bit over half of Mem Hay, because we're again trying to get ourselves about a daf ahead so that we'll be able to skip this coming Tuesday, because I will be taking a very early flight and not be able to run Daf Yomi that day. So let me share my screen and get us started. So we have been talking, we've been talking about the concern of uncertainty about who a parent is. And now we move from that topic to when you know that the parentage is problematic, namely the situation where a mamzer is produced. And as I mentioned yesterday, we're going to get the position of Rabbi Akiva, and the position of Rabbi Akiva is much, on some level, more strict than the position of the Chachamim. And the position of Rabbi Akiva is that even a lav prohibition, not just a kares prohibition, and not just a misa from based in prohibition, but even a lav prohibition will result in a mamzer. So let's take a look. We're at the Mishnah at the lower half of Mem Daled Amud Aleph, and let's get started.
David,
Yes, please.
just a word on sort of sensitivity thing. Uh, the moms are the person. That person is not. I mean, there's such a negative thing attached to it, right? But the person is not at fault, right? I mean,
Correct. There's no fault for the
so
person
yet the person is stigmatized, for various reasons, right? So
100%.
just I I I understand for purposes of Gemara, you could just say the mom's there, but I think just to keep in the back of your mind that it's a human being who has a status of mamzerut, but it's still right fully a person who's entitled to everything.
100%.
Okay,
100%.
just to keep that in the back of our minds is fine.
No, you're absolutely right to raise it. I mean, just as we say with respect to somebody who has a disability, that that disability does not define them, and doesn't. But in some ways, this is even usually disabilities are not the fault of the person who has the disability. This is similarly true here. There's no fault associated with this person. The person's parent made a mistake, and as we've seen, the mistake may have even been accidental, as in the case where the people went home accidentally with the wrong spouse. So, the things can happen, and so we do need to be aware of that. And so absolutely that, the mamzer, the reference to mamzer is literally just the status and not saying anything negative about the child himself or herself. So, okay, so let's get started again. So we're again at the Mishnah bottom of Mem Daled, and we're going to finally detail the specific debate between Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim. So Hamachzer Grusha, and Rashi points out Mishanisas, that the point is that if you return a divorcee, meaning that Reuven and Rachel were married. Reuven divorces Rachel, but and then they get married again. And Rashi clarifies that we're talking about where Rachel married someone else in the interim. In that situation, that second marriage is prohibited. It's not a kares penalty. It's just a lav, but it's prohibited. So that's the situation that we're talking about there. Hanose chalutza. So if after performing chalitza, so now Reuven has died, leaving his wife Rachel over to Shimon, and Shimon performs chalitza with Rachel, and then says, you know what, I regret that. I want to marry her, and so he goes ahead and marries her. And so that also is a situation where it's a lav. You're not allowed to marry her. And again, this is according to the view that the prohibition does not return to its original status. We saw that debate earlier about whether or not a chalutza becomes a full um, uh, former wife of a brother, in which case that would be actually a kares penalty, but instead is actually it's a lower level. And Hanozik Krovas Chalutza. So, and similarly, the relative of the Chalutza. So now again, Reuven was married to Rachel. Reuven dies. Rachel now does Chalitza with Shimon. And now Shimon says, hey, you know what? I happened to meet Leah along the way, and Leah is Rachel's sister, and he wants to marry her. Again, lav prohibition, and that same prohibition, again, without the chalitza, if Reuben had still been alive, then actually, I guess, then the prohibition was on Reuben to marry his wife's sister, and so that would be a prohibition that would apply, and that would actually be a kares prohibition. But here, because it's a chalutza, it is only a lav. It's not a kares prohibition. So, in each of those cases, this is what Rabbi Akiva is going to say. Yotzi v'havlad mamzer divrei Rabbi Akiva. They need to separate, and the child that is produced has the qualities of being a mamzer, is in that category. So the Chachamim Omrim ein avlad mamzer. They apparently would seem to agree with the sending away, meaning that they must separate, but the child is not a mamzer. Umodim, but the Chachamim would agree the nosi krovis grusha, so that when it comes to somebody who divorces their wife, and now the woman is still divorced. So again, Reuven divorces Rachel. Well, then if Reuven then marries either Rachel's sister, Rachel's mother, Rachel's daughter, in any of those cases, well, then shehavlad mamzer. Then even the Chachamim would agree that the child is a mamzer. We're going to clarify that last line as we go through today's daf, because it's not clear who is talking about marrying a relative of divorcee. That wasn't one of the categories that Rabbi Akiva mentioned, and that will be part of our discussion of the Gemara. So b'savar Rabbi Akiva hanosi krovus chalutza so havlad mamzer. So now we're going to begin by questioning, did Rabbi Akiva really say this position, that somebody who marries the relative of a chalutza, the relative again of Rachel, after Reuven has died and Shimon has done chalitza with her, is it really true that that Shimon cannot marry Rachel's sister or mother or daughter? So V'hamar Reish Lakish said, Kan Shana Rebbe, that regarding previous Mishnah that we learned on Mem Aleph Amud Aleph, so only a couple days ago, Kan Shana Rebbe Achos Grusha Midivrei Torah, that in fact the sister of a divorcee is from the Torah. That's a prohibition that's from the Torah. But achos chalutza medivrei sofrim. But the sister of a chalutza is only from the rabbis. And you can't imagine that the rabbis would say that such a relationship that only they prohibit will create the biblical category of mamzer. That doesn't make any sense. So is it really possible for Rabbi Akiva to have said that? So the answer is going to be absolutely. And in fact, that Rabbi Akiva, that there is a differing opinion from Reish Lakish, and Rabbi Akiva must go like that differing opinion. So that's going to be the final answer. But initially, we're going to propose that we're going to change the language in our Mishnah, and we're going to, again, because of the point that I made when I introduced the Mishnah, or when I was talking about the Mishnah, that the rabbis at the end talk about a relative of a divorcee. So we're going to say here, Tani Krovas Grusha So let's change it, and we'll talk about the relative of a divorcee. So Hachinami Mistabra, and indeed, changing the language in the Akiva's words makes a lot of sense, because after all, Dikatani Seifo, at the end of the Mishnah, what do we say? We say umodim benosik krovas grusha sosha vlad mamzer, that the chachamim admit that when it comes to the marrying the relative of a divorcee, that the child's a mamzer. So amrat bishlama iriba. So if you make this change, it all makes sense, because that's why the chachamim would talk about this topic, because after all, Rabbi Akiva mentioned it. That's why they say, and they agree. But if you don't change the language of the Mishnah to say that Rabbi Akiva is talking about the relative of a divorcee, so mayu modim, what does it mean that they agree? That we haven't even talked about that topic. So vidilma hakamashwan. So actually, you don't need to make this change based on the wording of the Seifa, that the Chachamim begin to talk about the relatives of a divorcee, because maybe this is what it's coming to teach. The Dilma Hakamashmal, and again, this is what it's coming to teach. That there is that what the Chachamim are saying is that when is there a mamzer? It's talking about when the relationship is one that is punishable with kares, and the relationship of a man to the relatives of his divorcee. So again, Reuven marries Rachel, divorces Rachel, and now he wants to marry Leah, his Rachel's sister. That is a punishable by kares marriage. So hakatani la lukatan. Well, one second. That point is going to specifically. I'm sorry, hakatani la lukaman. That point is going to be specifically said in a Mishnah later. So why do we need to say it now? So, because what is the Mishnah going to say? The Mishnah is going to say, and this is a Mishnah that we'll have in about 5 days. We'll have Ezahu Mamzer. Who's a Mamzer? Kol she'er basar shehu below yavo. Anyone who is subject to a negative commandment. Divrei Rabbi Akiva. That's what Rabbi Akiva says. So all you need is a lav. Rabbi Shimon Hatimni Omer Kol shechayavin alav kares bidei shemayim. And but Rabbi Shimon Hatimni says, no, it's got to be somebody where the punishment is kares. It's not sufficient for there to just be a lav. And we in fact paskin according to Rabbi Shimon Hatimni. And so as that shows that in fact we're going to already talk about that rule and give that rule in the next Mishnah. So why did we need to make the point here? So again, the question is, why talk about the case of a man who marries the relative of his divorcee when we haven't talked about it in the ratio? So we still have that question that we need to clarify. Go ahead.
Is that a pasuk in the Torah that you can't marry a relative of your divorcee? I mean, I don't. Is that explicit, or they're just learning it from somewhere?
I believe that they are. It is not explicit. What is explicit is you can't marry a relative of your wife, and I presume that the way that the psukim are written, it's not the wife category does not end as a result of the divorce, and so I believe that that's how it is derived. I'll have to double check, but I'm pretty sure that that's not considered forbidden, even though it's derived from. Even though it's not explicit in the verses, it's understood from the verses, and so as a result, it's still considered biblical.
But if a get is doraita, right? I mean, it talks about a get, then why is she still considered your wife? You know what I mean?
Yes, 100%. But and again, I don't remember the derivation of it offhand. I'll double check and see if I can have that for us tomorrow as to the basis that even a divorcee's relatives are prohibited. I don't remember it coming up as we go through this, but I'll as we, let me do some checking.
But they're saying that's krisis, not lav, right?
Correct, correct. It is definitely a kares penalty, not lav. We've understood it that way the entire time. That's part of the reason that in the very first Mishnah we said that if Reuven is married to Rachel and Shimon is married to Shira, and Rachel and Shira are sisters, and now and they're the only brothers. Reuven and Shimon are the only brothers, and now Reuven dies. Not only Shimon can't marry Rachel because it's Shira's sister, and she can't marry any other co-wife of Rachel either. That was the very first Mishnah. So it's definitely a kares prohibition because those were the categories that we were talking about on that very first day when we began Yevamot. So that's for sure is the case. Okay, so we are still stuck with this question of why did the end of the Mishnah mention the divorcee case when we hadn't actually raised it in the first place. The Dilma Kasasim law lan tanad Karebi Shimon Hatimni. So okay, so maybe it's telling us that the Chachamim, when it says Chachamim, that's essentially not telling us who the Mishnah is like. So it makes our Mishnah a machlokes va'achar kach stam situation. So therefore, it's telling us that the anonymous Mishnah is like Shimon Hatimni. So that's what it's doing. And so therefore, it's all okay. Well, im kain listen sharchaya bikrisus. Well, why not tell us all the other kares situations? Krovas grusha so lamali. Why did it specifically choose the marrying a relative of a divorcee? Elashmamina iriba. So it must be that Rabbi Akiva was discussing it. So as a result, in fact, we're going to say that it must be that Rabbi Akiva's language was not talking about a relative of a chalutza, but rather a relative of a grusha. So v'dilma la'olam lo iriba. No, in the end, we're going to say, nope, it doesn't have to be that Rabbi Akiva discussed a relative of a divorcee. It could be that he was talking about a relative of a chalutza. But I need a ton of machzir grusha so, the nose chalutza so, krovas chalutza so. So since the categories that we taught were somebody who remarries a divorcee after she marries somebody else, or marrying a chalutza, or marrying the relative of a chalutza, so Taninami Krovas Grusha. So the next logical category, right? The category that we're missing is marrying a Krovas Grusha. So if you think about it, right? So what's the first two categories? The first two categories are are taking back a wife whom you divorced. So, or separated from, whether it's grusha or chalutza. And the third category is taking a relative of a chalutza. Well, the one missing category is the relative of a gerusha. So that's the reason that the Chachamim actually talk about this category. So Ella Krovas Chalutza, so Rabbi Akiva Havi Mamzer. So it must be that in fact the relative of a chalutza is in fact a mamzer according to Rabbi Akiva. And so how is that possible, given that we had Reish Lakish's statement? So Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Hainu Taimid to Rabbi Akiva. The following explains Rabbi Akiva. The Amar Kra Beit Chalutz Hanal, that the pasuk says that when it comes to the description of the chalitza, that it is the house of the one whose shoe was removed, namely the yavam has his shoe removed by the yevama, by the woman who, by the widow, and that creates the chalitza, and so that house, because we say that you can't, that house is going to be so hakasuv kra'o beito. So because it says that they can't, that it's considered his house, and we say that once you've eliminated the house you're not allowed to come back and rebuild the house. And so since the house that house applies to the chalitza situation, so we'll apply the same prohibition that applies to chalutza to a chalutza's relatives. And so as a result, that is the basis for the prohibition. And since that prohibition now has a biblical source, so as a result, Rabbi Akiva can say that in fact that will produce somebody with the category of a mamzer. So, okay, so now that we've confirmed the fact that that Rabbi Akiva disagrees with Reish Lakish, now the Gemara is going to teach a ruling of basically saying everybody agrees with something, and then based on that agreement, we're going to try and figure out, okay, well, who's the everybody, and we'll go from there. So Amar Rabbi Yosef, Amar Rabbi Shimon bar Rabbi, that what did he say? He said Hakol modim b'machzir grusha. So everybody agrees that when it comes to somebody who remarries his divorcee, shehavlad pagum l'chahuna, that the child is not able to marry a Kohen. So mana kol modim. Who is this? Everybody agrees. So must be Shimon HaTimni, right? So we know it's not Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Akiva, of course, is the one who says that the product of such a relationship is actually a mamzer. So that is eliminated. So the obvious logical choice is the other opinion in our Mishnah, which of course we've aligned with Rabbi Shimon HaTimni from the Mishnah that's coming up in a couple of days, and so that's who it must be. The Avagata Amar Shimon HaTimni ein mamzer mechayvi lavin. That even though Shimon HaTimni says that you don't have a child that is actually a mamzer when you have a relations with somebody who is only prohibited with a negative commandment, with just a lav. Nehida mamzer lo havi. Yeah, it's true that they're not a mamzer, but pagum miu havi. But nonetheless, they are going to be considered not valid for marrying a kohen. B'kal v'chomer mi'almana, and it's a kal v'chomer from a widow. Why? What's the kal v'chomer? Uma almana l'chohen gadol she'ein isur shava b'kol. That when it comes to a almana, she's not allowed to marry a kohen gadol, but she can marry effectively anyone else. B'na pagum, and yet nonetheless, the child from a relationship with that kohen gadol will become tainted and not be able to marry a kohen. Zo she'isura shaveh b'kol. When it comes to a divorcee, who of anyone who divorces his wife, any man who divorces his wife is not going to be able to marry that woman if she has relations with somebody else. So that prohibition applies to everyone. Eino din shebena pagum. Well, then certainly in that situation of that relationship, that should certainly be problematic and result in the child who is pagum and unable to marry a kohen. And so now we're going to have three problems with what we just said, and we're going to then in reverse order address the three problems. So let's analyze the three problems with what we just said, the problems with the kal v'chomer. So ikalamifra, you can ask about this kal v'chomer and essentially undermine it. Umala almana shekain hi atzma mistalelas. There's a big difference between the almana situation and the Gerusha situation. In the almana situation, when she has relations with the Kohen Gadol, she becomes disqualified from the kahuna. And that is not the case with respect to the woman who was the remarried divorcee. She was already prohibited to marry any Kohen, but does not herself become desecrated. And that the category also includes this category of miskaleles also includes the following aspect to it. It's important to note. So it's not only that the woman not allowed. Sorry.
What does that mean that she's Mechalelet. What does
Yeah,
that
so I'm
mean?
about to, that's exactly what I'm about to highlight. So there are two aspects to it. So one aspect is that she's not allowed to marry a Kohen. And of course, a Grusha is already not allowed to marry a Kohen. And the second aspect is that if she is a Bas Kohen, she is not allowed to go back to her father's house and once again eat Truma. So those are the two aspects of the of this category of Mischaleles.
I mean,
So the
she can
point,
go back, but she can't eat the truma, or she's sort of stuck.
well, I mean, it's not saying that you're not welcome in your father's home. That's not the meaning. The meaning is that she ordinarily, if a Bas Kohen gets divorced or is widowed, then she's allowed to return to her father's house and once again eat his truma. And if, of course, if her husband was a Kohen, she'd also be able to eat truma there. But even if her husband was not a Kohen, she can go back and start eating truma from her father's house, and that is explicitly in the Torah, and we'll talk about it and reference it later today. So that is those are the two key aspects of the fact that she becomes mischalelet, a chalila. So anyway, so the point is that that's problem number one with our Kal V'chomer, because our Kal V'chomer requires that there be only lighter aspects to the widow, but we just found a stricter aspect to the widow, and so now that Kal V'chomer doesn't work anymore because maybe it's because there's a stricter aspect to the widow category. So that's problem number one. Problem number two, the ode, he toeva, that when it comes to the psukim in the Torah, it refers to her as a toeva, but it ve'ein baneha toavim. But the implication, again, this is the pasuk parak kav daled pasuk daled, if in Dvarim, that it specifically says that she is considered a toeva in that pasuk, and so as a result, the implication is she's a toeva, but not her children. And the third problem, va'od, Tanya hamachzer grusha so v'hanosi chalutza so v'hanosi krovas chalutza so. Rabbi Akiva, hamachzer grusha so v'hanosi chalutza so v'hanosi krovas chalutza so. Rabbi Akiva omer ein lo va kiddushin v'ein atzricha himenu get v'hi psula uvlada pasul v'chofen oso lahotzi. So Rabbi Akiva says that when it comes to remarrying a divorcee who's married somebody else, or marrying a chalutza, or marrying a relative of his chalutza, all those cases there's no kiddushin whatsoever, and so as a result, there is no requirement for a get, and she's disqualified, and the child is disqualified. The kofen oso lahotzi, and we force him to send her away. The chachamim omrim, the chachamim disagree. Yesh lo ba kiddushin, that there is kiddushin with her, utzricha and a get, and she does require a get, v'hi kshera, and she is not disqualified. She is kosher, uvlada kosher, and the child is kosher. So laman, so presumably, to whom do we say that the child is kosher? Lavla kahuna, must be that it's to the Kohen. And so we see that the chachamim, who are the position that we're trying to align with, and that we were saying this Shimon HaTimni, are also saying that this child of the relationship of the Maxir Grusha So situation is a kosher child and is not prohibited to the kahuna. So now we're going to again respond to each of these three questions, but we're going to do it in the reverse order. We're going to respond to the last question first. So lo, no. In fact, when we say kosher, we mean lekahal. We mean that that it's kosher to marry anybody in the entire Jewish people, but not. And we're just saying that the child is not a mamzer. we're not saying that they are in fact kosher to marry a Kohen. So ihachi hak shera leman. So 1 second, when you say that she is kosher, that what are you talking about? So ilema lekahal, if you say that she can marry another Jew, pshita, that's obvious. Mishum de zanya ipasul lekahal. Anybody who engages in immoral relations, it doesn't herself become prohibited. So elalav lekahuna. It must be that when we refer to her, that we're talking about to the Kohen. And and the fact that when we talk about her, it's referring to a Kohen, doesn't that mean that we have to be talking about for the child also to the Kohen? So midi area. So 1 second, how do you know? Hakadisa v'hakadisa. Maybe each one is its own category. One is qualified for the woman to marry a Kohen, and one is qualified for the child to be non-mamzer and marry anybody he wants, anybody he or she wants. And hachinami mustabra. And indeed, this approach makes a lot of sense, because if we look at Rabbi Akiva, we're going to see the same issue. The Ketani Resha, when we talk about Rabbi Akiva in the Resha, he psula uvlada pasul. We say that she is pasul and her child is pasul. He psula leman. When we say that she's pasul, who are we talking about? Ilema lekahal. If you want to try and say that she's pasul because she somehow becomes a mamzer, mishum dezanya pasla lekahal, just because she had relations that was inappropriate, does she become disqualified to the entire congregation? No, that's not true. It must be that she's disqualified for a Kohen. Uvlada pasul laman, and when according to Rabbi Akiva we say that the child is pasul, what are we talking about? Ilema lekahuna halakal kosher. If we were to say that it means that it's just for the kahuna, that would imply that for the rest of the congregation, the child would be qualified, meaning that the child would not be a mamzer. But ha'amar Rabbi Akiva havlat mamzer. But Rabbi Akiva says that the child is in fact in the category of mamzer. Ela pshita lekahal. So it must be that Rabbi Akiva is talking about the kahal. So miduresha hakadisa v'hakadisa. Seifanami hakadisa v'hakadisa. So given the fact that in the ratio, when we was Rabbi Akiva talking, we were talking about disqualifications that were different for the mother and different from the child. That for the mother it was a disqualification for kahuna, and for the child it was just the disqualification of being in the category of mamzer. So too in the seifa, when we were talking about the mother being kosher, we mean that the mother is kosher for kahuna, but when we talk about the child being kosher, we mean that the child is kosher and not considered part of the category of a mamzer. So we've now undermined the third question. Now we turn and undermine the second question. The hi toeva nami, and when it comes to the fact that she is referred to as a toeva, that also can be easily addressed. Hi toeva, the eina tsarasa toeva. No, when we say that she's a toeva, we are not saying that any of her co-wives are a toeva. So as a result, the fact that that this woman married somebody else. So again, Reuven married his former divorcee and another woman, and he now dies without children. So now the other woman, i.e. the co-wife, is not rejected. And so as a result, Shimon will be allowed to do yibum with that other wife, as long, and not with Rachel, the divorcee, who married another person and then Reuven took back. And
Is that
so
the
as a
general
result,
rule that Yibum still applies even if the marriage person who died was not really supposed to be married to that person? That's the rule. You know what I mean? It's a lav. The marriage was a lav.
yes, we saw that very, very early in Yevamot, I believe, and I don't remember the specific details. I think that there was a machlokas as to whether or not you have to perform yibum and chalitza with that person. But it was definitely clear that that situation is not covered by the first Mishnah. The first Mishnah is all dealing with situations of kares, kares prohibitions, and as a result, the co-wives of a kares prohibition effectively get precluded from yibum. But the co-wife of a lav situation is all still within the parsha of yibum, and so as a result, as I just mentioned, there would be potential to do yibum with Ruvain's co-wives, with the co-wives of Rachel, the divorcee, who was taken back after marrying someone else.
In other words, it's required to do Yibum.
Yes, exactly. You would have an obligation to do Yibum or Chalitza with one of them. Now, you can't do Yibum with Rachel because there's a lav prohibition associated with her, but you could do Yibum with one of the others. And so this might be, again, I don't remember how we fully came out in that case, but I believe that you have to do Chalitza. And so this might be one of those cases. Remember, we talked about it just a day or two ago about the situation where a man has two wives, and one of them is already puzzled for kahuna, and the other one is not. Now, the simplest of those cases is just where Rachel is divorced and remarries, even if she didn't remarry somebody else, where there's no isser involved in Ruvain's relationship with Rachel. But it also would apply in this situation where Ruvain takes back Rachel after she marries someone else. And so if there is any chalitza to be done, it should be done with Rachel rather than any of Rachel's co-wives, who, as a result of the death of Ruvain, would be permitted to marry a Kohen because they are only an almana and not a gerusha. They're a widow, not a divorcee. So you're absolutely right. The point that you made that this is that we do not preclude this situation from yibum. So the point is that when we say that she's a toeva, we're saying that the her co-wife is not a toeva, but aval bana toavin. But it could be that her children are toavin, that her children are considered to have a blemish of some sort, namely that they would not be allowed to marry a Kohen, according to Rishimon Hatimni. So, but we now go back to our first challenge. And our first challenge was to undermine the Kal V'chomer itself. And we will see that, in fact, the Kal V'chomer is undermined. And so we need to identify someone else as everyone agrees. So Ella Almana Kasha. But when it came to the Almana, again, we still have this difficulty. Mala Almana Shekain Hi Atzma Mischalelas. That when it comes to the Almana, who now has relations with the Kohen Gadol, she herself becomes a halala, and as a result, she is not allowed to marry another Kohen, and she's not allowed to go back to her father's house to eat truma. So Elai Atmar. So as a result, that Kal V'chomer is not valid, and so as a result, we cannot say that the Hakol Modim refers to Shimon HaTimni. So rather, Elai Itmar Hachi Itmar. Amar of Yosef, Amar of Shimon Berebi. Hakol Modim Biva al Chayve Krisos Havlad Pagam. So we'll read it, and we'll say that everybody agrees that if you have relations with somebody who is a Chayve Krisos, well, then the child will become unable to marry a Kohen and unable to return to her father's house as a Kohen. So man hakol modim. So okay, so you've reread it and you've changed the statement, and so now who is the all agree? So the all agree is Rabbi Yoshua. So the Aval Gav to Rabbi Yeshua in Mamzer Mechayvek Krisos, because there's a third opinion. We had only two opinions in our Mishnah, but there is a third opinion about the status of Mamzer, and that's Rabbi Yeshua. Because Rabbi Yeshua says that Mamzer does not result from kares penalty prohibitions. Nehi de Mamzer lo havi. So, and by the way, what does he say? He says that a Mamzer is only a woman who is produced from a woman from a relationship that actually is chayev misas bastin, that only if you're obligated with penalty of punishment by death by court, that is the only situation where there's a mamzer. So that would be the classic situation of an extramarital affair by a wife. So if a wife has an extramarital affair and that affair produces a child, not only are the parents chayev misas bastin, but the child is in the category of mamzer. Now, of course, everybody agrees with that. So, both Shimon HaTimni and Rabbi Akiva would agree that is also, both of them agree, again, everybody else goes even more categories. So you have, again, going through the different categories, Rabbi Yeshua limits it to misas bastin. Shimon HaTimni adds the category of kares, and Rabbi Akiva adds the category of lav. So now we'll say that when it says that everybody agrees that the product of a kares relationship is going to be prohibited to marry a kohen. So the point is, nehi de mamzer lo habi. It's not. While Rabbi Yeshua agrees that it's not a mamzer, the child's not a mamzer, pagum miyahabi, but it will still be considered pagum with respect to kahuna. So mikal v'chomer mi'almana, and indeed the kal v'chomer that we had with respect to an almana would exist here. Uma almana l'chohen gadol she'ein asura shavet b'kol v'na pagum zeshe asura shavet b'kol eino din shabana pagum. Again, so we have that same kal v'chomer that an almana is not prohibited to everyone, rather only to a kohen gadol, the category of almana, whereas the category of sister, of mother, etc., or a married woman, all those categories are actually, I'm not sure. Anyway, but certainly the married woman category is prohibited to everyone else. So isn't that certainly covered by pagum? And if you want to come back and say, well, 1 second, what about the fact that by an almana, she herself becomes a chalala as a result of having her relations with the kohen gadol? So hachanami kevan sheba'ala asa zona. Since this married woman had an affair, she too will be considered a zona and therefore a chalala, and therefore unable to go back to her father's house if she herself was a bas kohen, and is not going to be allowed to marry anyone else if in fact her husband was to die and she become a widow. She would not be allowed to marry a kohen. So so that is the end of that first discussion. Now we're going to have the exact same discussion about a similar statement. So again, the first statement was, everybody agrees with something, and then who is that everybody, and who is that all, and then and we go and we work our way through that. So now we have Amar Rabbi Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Hakol Modim be'eved ve'ovi kochavim habal bas Yisrael shahavlad mamzer. That everybody agrees with respect to a non-Jew. And by the way, I'll just note that we do not paskin this way. This is not, in fact, how we paskin. That a non-Jew or a slave who has relationship with a Jewish woman, that the child is a mamzer. So who is that everyone? So again, clearly it includes Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Akiva is the one who says that it's a problem. So manakol madum. So we're going to start again with our supposition that it's Shimon HaTimni, that it must be Shimon HaTimni. Da'afa gav da'amar Shimon HaTimni ein mamzer mechayve love, and that even though the prohibition of a relationship between a non-Jew and a Jewish woman, or a slave and a Jewish woman, is only a lav, it is not in fact actually punishable by kares. Hani mili, when we say that a lav prohibition, and now we turn to Memhei Amud Aleph, that we say that not lav prohibition only is mechayve lavin, that we don't that we say that a product of a chayve lavin prohibition is not going to be a mamzer. That is this tafsei behu kedushin. That is where kedushin applies. So that's the situation. But since there's no possibility of kedushin with respect to them, there it's there it's like a kares situation, and therefore the offspring will be in the category of mamzer. So meisvei. So in second, so we're going to challenge this position and say it can't be Shimon Timni, because what do we say? We have a brisa that says the following: Havlad mamzer. So the first position in our in this brisa is that the child of that product of that relationship is in fact a mamzer. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda Omer. Ein mamzer elamamisha isura isur arva v'anush kares. No, when we say that there's a prohibition, there's a possibility of a mamzer, that mamzer category only applies when it's an isur erva and the punishment is kares. You need both those aspects, and so that is not true with respect to a non-Jew or a slave. And since this position is identical to Shimon HaTimni's position, that mamzer status only comes from a kares-bearing relationship, so as a result, that it can't be that it's Shimon HaTimni in our who is being referred to as the everyone agrees that this relationship between a Jewish woman and either a non-Jew or a slave is going to produce a mamzer. Now, technically, of course,
I thought Isur, Irva, and Karet were the same thing. I mean, I thought they were just describing the same thing. You know what I mean?
I do know what you mean, and I'm not 100% sure that I know that I could describe the difference between them. Let me write that one down.
Okay, I thought, by definition, any Isur Irva was Karet, and I guess vice versa.
Yeah.
You'd have to think of a case where one is Karet.
Yeah,
but
I'm not sure of that. So that was the question number one. What was the first question? Now I'm sorry that I've forgotten the first question that you asked that I said I was going to go and look into.
I'll have to think of it. Keep going.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Shoot. Okay.
No, don't worry.
All right. So, all right.
Now,
so
the first question was about if it was based on the pasuk that he could not marry, he could not
Yes.
actually
The-
get with the divorcee.
The relatives of a divorcee.
The relatives of the divorcee.
Right. Relatives of.
Yeshikoach, Miriam. Well done.
Exactly.
I'm listening once in a while,
No, that's very. Our relatives, there's a source in the Torah. All right. Okay. All right. I got these two questions. I will, God willing, have answers for them, God willing, tomorrow. But thank you so much for asking them because they're good questions. Okay. So, and of course, technically, there's no reason that we can't say that Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda just disagrees with Shimon HaTimni. But the point is, we have no source to suggest that. And so just saying, given that this is a later statement, to say, that everybody agrees. So that's we given the fact that we have a basis to say that that it's not Shimon Timni, we need to find somebody else. So Ella Amar Rav Yosef, Mana Kol Modim, Rebbe. Who is the person that's referred to? It is Rebbe. Sa'afal got the Rebbe Omer Ein Hadvarim Halalu Amurin Ella L'Divrei Rebbe Akiva. That when he was describing the position of Rebbe Akiva, he said that these words were, and this is from a brisa, that these words were only according to the opinion of Rebbe Akiva, Shahaya Osa Chalutza Ke'erva, because he considers a chalutza like an erva. V'lei lo svirulei. And of course, that implies that Rebbe Yehuda does not agree with Rebbe Akiva, because if he were to agree with Rebbe Akiva, he wouldn't just say that these are the words only according to Rebbe Akiva, because he would say that he agrees with it. So, but yet it could be that even though he disagrees with Rebbe Akiva, we now have an additional opinion, and maybe he agrees that the child of a woman with a Jewish woman with a non-Jew or a slave is considered a mamzer. Also, Rav Dimi, Amar Rav Yitzchak bar Avudimi, Mishum Rabbeinu, Ovid Kochavim, the Eved Abal Beis Yisrael, Abbas Yisrael, Havlad mamzer. That when it comes to when Rav Dimi came to Bavel from Eretz Yisrael, he said that it was said in the name of Rabbeinu, namely Rabbi, that in fact this was the law. So, and now we're going to teach a story that highlights that fact. So Rabbi Ach Echa Sar Habira Rabbi Tanchum Brei the Rabbi Chia Ish Kfar Akko. So we had these two people, Rabbi Acha and Tanchum, and Parukanu Shavuyasa the Asum Armon Litiveria. And they were successful in ransoming some Jewish captive women that were taken from Armon to Tveria. And so and unfortunately one of them had been impregnated by one of her captors who isn't Jewish. And it came before Rabbi Ami. So Amar Lahu, Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Chanina, the Amri Ovid Kochavim, the Eved Abal Beis Yisrael, Havlad Mamser. So he notes the fact that Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Elazar, and Rabbi Chanina all say that the child is a mamzer. So now Amar Rav Yosef, Ravusa L'Machshav Gabri, is this just a great thing to just list off a bunch of opinions? That's not a psak. That's not how you engage in determining what the answer is. It's not necessarily based on just numbers of opinions. Of Ravu Shmuel Bevavel, Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, Uvar Kapara Be'eretz Yisrael. We got 4 different people. Eva Amri La Chalufe Bar Kapara Ba'ile Zikne Daram the Amri. And some people say don't use Bar Kapara in that list, but rather say Zikne Daram, the elders of the south. So we may have even more than 4 people, and all of them say Obed Kuchavim the Eved Abal Bas Yisrael Havlad Kosher. They all say that it's kosher. So this is not just a competition of who can list the most opinions. Ella Amar Rabbi Yosef. So Rabbi Yosef explains that what was the point that was being made about this? It's Rebbe. The point is that Rebbe is the one who ruled in this way. Again, the same statement that we had earlier. Ovid Kochavim, the Eved Abba Bais Yisrael, Havlad Mamzer. So in fact, that and again, this was in the name of Rebbe. So that's the key statement. So Rabbi Yeshua ben. All right. So now that we said that, so we've now explained the position that they came to. So now we're going to note that there are other opinions about the nature of this child that is produced between the Jewish woman and either a slave or a non-Jewish man. Okay, so Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi Omer Havlad Mikukal, that the child has some kind of impairment. Again, this is essentially the same category as pagum. It's understood to mean the same thing. So Laman, according to who? Who is it? Is it pagum for? Who is it not kosher for? So Ilay Milikahal, if you want to say that the child actually is considered a mamzer and as a result can't go marry anybody in the entire congregation. Ha'amar Rabbi Yeshua Vlad Kosher. We cited Rabbi Yeshua above, who's saying that the child is not in fact a mamzer, that the child is in fact kosher. Ela kahuna. So therefore, it must be that it's talking about the kahuna. The kula amorai, the ma'aksharei modu shavlad pagum l'kahuna mikal v'chomer me'almana. And again, all the different amoraim who say that the child is fit, they all say that there's a problem with the Kohen. And again, it's the same Kal V'chomer from Amana that we saw earlier. Ma'almana l'chohen gadol she'ein isura shava b'kol, that when it comes to a widow who doesn't have a prohibition according to everybody, meaning most people are not prohibited to marry a widow, but not pagum. But yet, if she has a relationship with the Kohen Gadol who is prohibited to marry a widow, the child is considered pagum. Zoshi surashavelikol. That when it comes to a non-Jew or a slave who are prohibited to marry any Jewish woman, so then Eno din shebna pagum. Then she should certainly be considered pagum. So Mala Almana Lachoin Gadol Shekain Hi Asma Mischalelas. Well, 1 second. What about the fact that the widow herself becomes a chaleles, a chalala for and is not able to marry another Kohen after having that relations with the Kohen Gadol, and also not able to go back to her father's house. So Hachanami Kevan Sheniv Ala Psala. So too here, because the woman had relationship with a non-Jew or a slave, she that will disqualify her from being able to go to marry a Kohen or go back to her father's house if she was a Bas Kohen to eat Truma. The Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Shimon, because we have a statement of Rabbi Yochanan. Minayin la'obi kochavim ve'eved haba al kohenes va'al halabiyav al Yisraelis shepsaluha. And how do we know that if a non-Jew has relationship with a Jewish woman, whether she's a Kohen, a Levi, or a Yisrael, that it causes her to be unfit to eat Truma? Shneamar uvas Kohen ki tiyeh almana ugrusha. Who is it that's allowed to go back to her father's house? It's the daughter of a Kohen who becomes a widow or a divorcee. So Mishi Yeshlo almanus v'gerushin ba. Only those relationships that she has where she can be either a widow or a divorcee, those are the relationships that will allow her to go back to eat Truma in her father's house. Yatsu Ovid Kochavim the Evet she'ein lahem almanus v'gerushin ba. But that comes to exclude the categories of a non-Jew or a slave where there is no possibility of being a widow or a divorcee in having a relationship with them. And so as a result, in those situations where a Jewish woman has such a relationship, she will not only not be able to go back and eat Truma with her father's house, but she will also become unable to marry a Kohen. So Amrle Abaye says to Rav Yosef, my chazes tesmach ad Rav Dimi. You reference, Rav Yosef, the fact that when Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, that's how you know that it was Rebbe who took this opinion. Samach ad Ravin. We have another report that Ravin said, because Dechi Asa Ravin Amar, when Ravin came to Bavel, what did he say? He said, Rabbi Nassan, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi Morimba Lahatera, that Rabbi Nassan and Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi actually were lenient on this matter. Uman Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rebbe, and that Rebbe is Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. Va'af Rav Mora Bahatera, and similarly we have Rav saying that it was mutter. Dahuda Asal Kamei de Rav, because there was this person who came in front of Rav and Amrle Ovid Kochavim ve'Eved Habal Bas Yisrael Mahu. What's the law of a product of a Jewish woman and a non-Jew or a slave? So Amrle Havlad Kasher. Rav said back, the child is kosher. There's no mamzerut that applies, and so as a result, they can marry anybody within the Jewish people. So Amrle, the guy said, well, Havli bar Bretech, give me your daughter. I am such a person. I would like to marry your daughter. And he says, Lo yehivnelach, I'm not going to give her to you. So Amr Shimi bar Chia LaRav. So Rav Shimi bar Chia said to Rav, and he used a colloquialism. So Amre Inchi, what do people say? Gamlam b'madai akaba rakta, that a camel in Madai can dance in a basket that is holding a kav. Now that's a relatively small amount, and it's meant to be that you can, I guess it's the idea is that it's something along the lines of when pigs fly in Madai. So then we say ha-kaba, ha-gamla, ha-madai, below rakta. So and now yet, what do we have here? We've got the kav, we've got the camel, and we've got Madai, and we don't see that the camel dancing. Meaning, if you're going to say something is true, well, then we should see it in actuality. And yet, what you are telling this person is that you won't let your daughter marry him. And so as a result, is your statement really true? So Amrle, Ina heavy Yoshua bin Nun, lo yehivna le Bartek. If this guy were as great as Yeshua ben Nun, I would not give him my daughter. So Amrle, Ihavik Yeshua ben Nun. Imar lo yahiv le achrina yahiv le. That's fine and dandy that you wouldn't give him if he was as great as Yeshua ben Nun. But if he was as great as Yeshua ben Nun, he wouldn't need your daughter. He'd be able to find somebody else. Imar lo yahiv le achrina lo yahiv le. But if you don't give your daughter to him, nobody else is going to give their daughter to such a person otherwise. Lo hava ka'azol mikameh. The guy, of course, the person didn't, Rav refused, and the person wouldn't leave him. He kept persisting. So Rav ended up looking at him in a certain way, and the guy died. Very problematic as to whether this guy, what did this guy do to deserve such a reaction? Obviously, on some level, he was being obnoxious, but at the same time, this man was desperate, and so very, very not really capable for right now going through how we can understand this situation. And we similarly have Ramasnas teaching it that it's mutter. Yehuda Morabella Hetera. Similarly, Rabbi Yehuda said it was mutter. The Rabbi Yehuda Amar Le Zil Itamer. Nasiv Bas Minach. So then not only did Rabbi Yehuda say it was okay, but he said, listen, don't disclose your status and that way, or go marry somebody like yourself. Oh, go into Golos, Nasiv Bas Minach, or marry somebody like yourself. Shalchule b'nei mei be'michse l'Rabba. So it was asked from be'michse to Rabba. Mishachetzu eved. You know what? All right, let's stop. We'll stop. You know what? Let's see if we can get to where. So now a related question: what happens if the person is a half slave, half free person? So shalchule b'nei michse l'Rabba. So mishachetzu eved b'chetzu ben chorin haba al bas Yisrael mahu. What's the story of somebody who's half free and half slave? So Amar lahu, he said to them, Hashta eved kulo amrin and kasher chetzu mibai. If a full slave produces a kosher child, well then certainly a half slave should be kosher. So Amar of Yosef Mara Deshmaita 1 second, but we had that the person who taught this was Manu Rav Yehuda. It was Rav Yehuda. Amar Rav Yehuda Mishachetzu Eved B'Chetzu Ben Chorin Habal Bas Yisrael Oso Vlad Emo Takana. We said that child has no fix. So this seems to be an inconsistency, because on the one hand, if the person was a full slave, it's the child is fine. But if they are a half slave, the child is a mamzer. So ki itmer to Rav Yehuda. So we need to clarify what case Rav Yehuda was talking about. We're going to give two possibilities. The first one is going to be rejected, and the second one will be the final possibility. So ki itmer to Rav Yehuda kagong de Kaddish bas Yisrael the nimsa. Sad Avdus Shabos Mishtamish Be'eshes Ish. So what happened is the half slave married a Jewish woman. And so now we have the half that's free married the Jewish woman, but now the half that's a slave is sleeping with a married woman. V'hamrei, 1 second, that doesn't work, because v'hamrei nar dai mishmei de Rabbi Yaakov l'divrei haposel afilu b'funya. The one who says that you're not allowed to marry, that the child is a mamzer, says that the child is a mamzer even if the Jewish woman is not married. But the one who says that the child of the slave and the Jewish woman is not a mamzer, says that the child is not a mamzer even if the woman is married. And both of them derive it from the prohibition of marrying a father's wife. So Mad de Puzzle Sabar, the one who says that it's a problem, says the following: Ma Ashas Abdullo Tafsiba Kedushin Havlad Mamzer. What's the issue with marrying a father's wife? It is sufficiently prohibited that marriage is not a valid marriage, and so that's why the offspring is a mamzer. So Af Kol Delo Tafsiba Kedushin Havlad Mamzer. So too, anytime kedushin is not effective, and as that is the case with a Jew marrying a slave or a non-Jew, so then the offspring is going to be a mamzer. And the one who says that it's kosher, the child says the following: Ma Ashes Abdaliti De Lo Tafsiba Kedushin Akrini Tafsiba Kedushin, that when it comes to a father's wife, the son is the one with whom the father's wife cannot have Kedushin. But other people, if the father were to die, would be able to have Kedushin with her. So but when it comes to a slave or a non-Jew, Kedushin doesn't apply at all. So it can't be that Rabbi Yehuda's case was talking about where the half that was a free person married the Jewish woman, and now we have a problem because the half that was a slave was having the relations with her. But rather, Elaki Idmar de Rabbi Yehuda, Kigon Shabal Ashes Ish, where the half slave, half free man ended up having relations with a married woman. The Nimtz Tzad Cheres Shabo Mishtamish Be'ashes Ish, and so the half that was free was having relations with the married woman, and so that was what was causing the problem, and that is why the child would be a mamzer. But if in an ordinary case, if a half free person, half slave person were to just have relations with a Jewish woman, that in and of itself, if that woman were not married to somebody else, would not result in a mamzer. And so we'll stop there, and we'll continue our discussion of various cases with and specifically various questions that were asked, God and situations, God willing, tomorrow.
Thank you. Shkoch.
Have a wonderful day.